Sometimes there is something happening in the world. Often enough, it's politics, or it can be the most boring story on the face of the earth, but it affects us all. It affects us all, and we call them streeters, and we go to the street and we see what people are thinking. And sometimes, and you're right, sometimes there's not an expert, or there's people who don't want to talk about it. They're taking their time in preparing whatever it is, whether it's a scandal, whether it's a whatever, and they don't want to. So we go to the people. But it's also a way to challenge people not talking about things.
A TV interview is among the most intrusive and disruptive requests that a communicator will receive when they're in a challenging media spotlight. But TV also offers the biggest bang for your communications buck when you want to broadly pitch a story or a personality from your organization in a positive light. It can definitely be a schizophrenic medium. If you've ever had to navigate a TV interview, or perhaps prepare someone else for one, and wondered what the interviewer, the TV reporter, had to consider when they were piecing the story together, well, stay tuned. TaraOverholtYouTube1 of CityTV in Calgary, Alberta is our guest this time, another journalist offering insights from the other side of the media microphone. Here on Speaking of Media, the podcast where communicators and the media come together to consider the world of mass storytelling. I'm your host, Keith Marnock, former journalist turned corporate communicator, and I'm hoping that you, as someone who communicates on behalf of your organization, will join me for each episode as we learn from industry experts about tangible ways to share your stories and messages, and also how to avoid getting caught in a negative media storm. TaraOverholtYouTube1 is a veteran TV reporter who moved from Ontario to Alberta in the last few years and has continued her broadcasting career as a news anchor and reporter for CityTV in Calgary. We connected with Tara via Zoom. And so it's my pleasure to welcome TaraOverholtYouTube1 to Speaking of Media podcast. Tara, thanks so much for taking the time to check in on the podcast from Calgary.
Yeah, it's great to see you. I hope you're not as chilly as I am, but we'll go with it.
So you're an Ontario girl who sort of made good and did things here in sort of central Canada before heading out west. For those who don't know about your career, just quickly, how did you find yourself in Calgary eventually?
Well, I started off in London, Ontario it used to be way back in the day, Chum. So many different names at that station.
Yep.
And I started as a videographer. I worked in sports as a news anchor and a news reporter for about 5 or 6 years and getting back into news. And then I ended up, after about 15 or 16 years at the station, I left as the 6 o'clock news anchor. Where I had done so many different roles, from producing and anchoring and reporting and of course sports as well. And then I moved to Calgary for my personal life, and I now work at CityTV in Calgary, where I am the host and anchor at 6 o'clock as well as at 11. And I also do some reporting as well.
That's great. And so, so back in the day, you were quite the sports person, I know, sports athlete. That transition, was the news business always in mind for you as you were going through school and trying to find something to hit on?
I really enjoyed my time in sports. It was kind of at the time, I think it was like 2002, and there was a real push to have women in sports. So I like sports. I like watching. I like playing. Am I the girls that I watch on TSN now? Probably not. Not maybe as big of a fan as they are. But it was an opportunity that they brought to me. And I said, why not try? Because one of the key things in this business is always to grow and to always say yes to opportunities that are going to allow you to learn and to grow. And I will say doing sports was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. And I think you really actually learn a lot about storytelling when it comes to telling sports, because that's what I was able to do. I was able to choose the stories that I wanted to, especially at Western and things like that. My goal was always trying to highlight the stories that maybe you didn't normally see. A lot of women's sports that really pushed to try and get women's sports on our station and to highlight those athletes and what they were doing. And there was a real groundswell, I think, of interest at that time too, and a real push for women's sports and a push to be seen. And I really, truly enjoyed that aspect of it. But after about 5 or 6 years of it, I was ready for change. And I was also ready for a little bit more responsibility. And so there was an opportunity at our station and it made sense. And I got to do the weekend anchoring, but then I got to also kind of run things a little bit more. And I got to, take the helm of making editorial decisions. And, that later on, I was the 11 o'clock anchor and I was producing. And so then you're not in charge, but for lack of a better term, there's no supervisors at night. So you're the one leading the show and melding it and trying to make it make sense
Yeah.
and in a news sense. So I really enjoyed that opportunity to kind of be part of something a little bit bigger than just the sports side.
Yeah. So going back to sort of those early days, can you remember times? And again, we've got Tara Overholt here on the Speaking of Media podcast, and our audience often tunes in is made up of communicators. So again, we're trying to sort of make the connection or have a better understanding for them in terms of how they can deal with the media and so on. Can you think back to early days, Tara, when you were starting reporting more than anything else? What were the things that made it really difficult for you to put a story together? What are the elements? Like from television, I know it can be very intrusive to people, or it's very intense. You need to have certain things fall into place that other types of platforms don't, right?
You really do. And things have definitely changed even in the last, like when I was first starting out as a general assignment reporter. So we'll say maybe 2005, 2006, people didn't have social media. Like Facebook was just really starting to take. So you had to call people constantly. And we didn't even have like Blackberries or smartphones at work yet. So we couldn't be out in the field and be producing things at the same time. So you had to like make your phone calls, hope that they would call your producer as you're trying to go out and shoot other interviews and things like that. So timing used to be one of the hugest things that was incredibly difficult. Nailing people down, it can be incredibly intrusive too. Like, hi, I'm Tara from the news. Would you be willing to come on television and tell us your views on this in the next hour? Because I have a deadline and it needs to be edited. I can even just look at things, how things have changed, even with COVID and the pandemic. Now everybody's used to Zoom. Everybody's at home. We've actually had more luck getting people to talk to us in the past year because everyone's available and everybody knows how to use Zoom. They're not afraid of it. So it's not like, well, can I just do it on the phone? Everybody uses Zoom or everybody uses FaceTime or whatever, what have you. Right. So that has been a game changer because really, at the end of the day, I always say reporting is 85% problem solving. You are constantly problem solving. You're like, okay, I'm going to interview these 3 people for this story. Okay, I got to reach out to them. I've got to get this. I've got to get this video. I've got to get, and it's like you're a puzzle of putting your story together. And then if one person backs out, then you don't have the balanced story. Then if you have technical failings, which everybody does, there's always, it's just like, okay, how do I recover this story? And then sometimes you interview somebody and you're like, this isn't even a story. And the story completely changes for you. And then you're trying to make it all make sense. So I always say that you need to be a problem solver. So when you're dealing with communicators, I think that if you can help us solve problems, you are going to make our life so much easier. Mm-hmm. And that's a good thing. Because when our lives are easier, and I don't mean that you need to make life easy for the press, but it makes a smoother story. Instead of me just going back going like, I know that they said something about X, Y, and Z, bang, 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 and you're just banging out a story to try and get it for that deadline of 5, 6 o'clock, whatever, what have you. Right. You are, you have time to be thoughtful. You have more time to edit your words versus just like, and they said this. So the more time you have, the more time you have to sculpt something to make it pretty, to make it sing, to make it be a story rather than just be a report.
Good. And, and again, if the communication side of things or the person who you're interviewing is feeling like they're well prepared, then if you've got more time, then you can be more, like you're saying, it's probably better value for both if that's happening.
Mm-hmm. I think being a well-prepared, and here's the other thing about general assignment reporting. One day you could be out in the middle of a cow field. The next day you could be going to a prime minister's press conference, or there could be a scandal at the hospital. You don't know everything, and you have to be okay with not knowing everything. You are literally like looking things up. Your producer's sending you, past articles, all that kind of stuff, any information they can have. They might have a better, scope on things. You're listening things on the radio. You're trying to figure out, so sometimes you get to it. And there have been times where I've gone to the person because they're an expert in whatever topic and they were like, honest, I don't really know what's going on. Can you please dumb it down for me? Which is also not a bad thing to say because our audience doesn't know either. They're not experts. So It's okay to have this person speak to us, and we have to remember that we write for a grade 8 or 9 level, because that's, people don't pay attention. They're doing 17 other things while they're watching or ingesting any kind of media. So it's okay to ask those kind of dumb questions to allow us to, and so an interviewee needs to expect that we're going to ask some really dumb questions.
Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you have a sense when you're, and I find it fascinating. So the whole COVID thing with people on Zoom and remote connection and so on, it actually does change your news cycle, or your news day, I guess, your news collection.
It has. I feel bad for infectious disease experts who, there's this one that we bug at the University of Calgary, Craig Jenny, and one day I asked him, I'm like, so how many Zoom calls do you usually do in a day? And he's like, oh, I had to create a whole setup, because he's like, half of my job now, or if not more, is just constant. Every single channel, every single outlet, wants to get your 2 cents on whatever, what have you, is the latest in COVID. Mm-hmm. But it has made it so much easier in that fashion that people are set up. Lots of people have ring lights, or they know how to, set up a nice light.
Yep.
So it's gathering that information has become easier in a sense. It doesn't always look as good for television. You know what I mean? We don't have our B-roll and things like that of them walking in, or the classic playing on the computer, visuals, but it really does help in the gathering of information.
Yeah. It sort of makes it more of a concise process, I suppose. Because one of the things I can recall as a communication person who would prep people to be on the air is that unlike other media, television, like you say, the walk and talk, the 2-shot, all those other things can really be sort of, it can put people off. Like they're not used to TV and sort of being on air and so on. And those elements can sometimes take away from the very simple messages that often they're trying to convey. And they get kind of like, mesmerized by the system. Like you say, they're now conducting interviews day to day. They're meetings like this, and now this is kind of just like another meeting for them. So what tips you off to somebody who is or isn't prepared when you talk to them, either in the COVID world or otherwise? Are there things that stand out to you when, like you say, you may not know something too much about something, and you're maybe trying to ask some simple questions, but every story needs to have a little bit of newsworthiness, be it conflict or some sort of element that's kind of bringing it forward. And there's obviously people that you run into who do it well and who don't. Anything that in particular come to mind when you talk about traits or elements that people present to you from a television point of view when they're doing a story?
I think being well prepped shows. And whether that's the person themselves has done the homework, if they've had the opportunity. I mean, it really depends on the situation. It's if a day of thing, it's really hard to prep somebody who's never done TV before. If they don't have the time, right? Or if they don't have a person telling them what to expect. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of the time, if I'm interviewing somebody, they'll be like, can you just give me a couple of questions that you're going to ask? I'm like, absolutely. I want you to sit on these. I want you to ruminate. I want you to stand in the shower before we have the interview and say them out loud.
Yeah.
And the key really honestly is to think about them. Like even last night, I was thinking about what I was going to say to you, just because you want to kind of get words formed, sentences formed, ideas that you want to talk about. And it's like your third draft. Often enough in an interview, I sometimes ask a person the same question 3 different ways, because they're not giving it to me the right way. Because, you know what I mean? So it's like the first draft, they're kind of like, well, they might stumble over their words. The second time, I'm trying to get them to frame it the way that I want it for television purposes. And then the third time, they've gone from, 4 sentences to 2. And you're like, there you go. That's what I needed. Not everybody speaks in sound bites. And you don't want just somebody who is 15-second clip, and no actual nuance or any kind of actual information.
Right.
But practicing helps, and being prepped. And whether you're a communicator, prepping someone for an interview, it's giving them the obvious questions. It is, giving them the idea of, and because it's television, they might want you to walk into, how many times I've had to explain that to people and say like, and now we need this, and I try to say like, when I say Joe is expert on sciences or whatever, we need to have some visuals of you. And then it kind of registers to them. But it takes a lot of time out of our day if we're coaching them.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like somebody should have given them a heads up.
Right. It's interesting that you say that you
So at the end of the day, I would say prep.
Nice. It's interesting that you say, you sense that you've got an answer that you like, or that you can use, or that fits within your story, but that you've got to kind of get it said in a different way. On this side of the media microphone, I am, what I'm telling people is that here's the two things that we want, maybe one thing that we really want to communicate. And it's not terrible to try to keep saying it, or to be in a finesse way, if they're able to circle back to it, bridge, as we would say, to, the answers that they're really trying to portray. So there's, I'm hearing, and this is great, I'm hearing sort of the both sides of the, the give and take on the interview. And I think it's valuable for communicators to understand that. I often say that, an interview, especially the kind that we're talking about, is not necessarily a conversation. Both sides have objectives here, and they're not necessarily sort of like trying to trick each other. But the reality is that you're trying to get a story, and the person who's being interviewed should have in their mind the story that they want to tell, whatever that might be. But it's fascinating to hear you kind of walk through that. When something's a little bit more controversial, or a little bit more, challenging for people, anything you do differently to prepare? Would you be less likely to ask a base question to someone who you're really going more for content to than for information?
It depends on the situation. If you're part of a scrum, you might not waste your question on something like that. If there's only, I was lucky enough to go and cover the federal election in 2019, and I was at Andrew Scheer's campaign, and that was kind of cool because it was a completely different scene than I was normally used to, where access is limited, right? The day after, there's only 10 questions and everybody's queued up, and journalists are talking like, which questions do we need to get to? You know what I mean? Kind of, working for everybody in that fashion. Mm-hmm. But if it's just a one-on-one, or then you might not worry, because sometimes you might not know how well prepped this person is or how comfortable it is. A lot of people will use question one as a throwaway question. And that's just let's just, make sure your mic's working properly, you're comfortable, you're not stumbling, just a warm up, a nice little pitch in. Mm-hmm. And then we'll get to it. And it's just to make everybody feel like, okay, you got number one and under your belt. If they're a nervous person, if they're a seasoned professional at this, if they're a politician or they're whatever, you might not, if you don't have the time, you might not be wasting your first question, but don't be, you would be sometimes, re-asking questions to try and get that specific point that perhaps they can't spin around, and asking a direct question of a yes or no, or what have you done to, mitigate this problem. So then it might change. It's funny how you really just sometimes have to roll with the scene and the access. And sometimes you're expecting one thing and you get something completely different. Every once in a while, you get somebody who might be in something controversial and you have great access and the person's open. And it's funny how a person who is open might change the story.
This is exactly what
it might, instead of somebody, like somebody where you're allowed to have a little bit of time. Sorry, say that again.
Would you have an example of something like that, even generic, sort of like you're going in and suddenly your story gets turned upside down because of what someone may have revealed, or, even generically, just that can happen, I guess.
It can happen, I can't think of anything off the top of my head because I've been doing this for too many years and things start to blend together. But I do know that opportunity and I have the time, I love it when I'm able to just talk to my interviewee, whether they are an expert in science, whether they're a hospital person.
This answer, because we were just to keep going with that thought, but just clean from the top. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. What I noticed that sometimes I really like to be able to have a little bit of one-on-one time with the person. If you have the time, whether it's an expert in science, whether it is a police officer, whatever, what have you, politician, somebody you're interviewing, or just the most generic person down the street that something interesting happened to. If time allows, and you're allowed to, sometimes there's PR people lurking. But if you can, and I get it, they're doing their job, but if you can just kind of get to a personal level, sometimes the most random question of talking about the weather or talking about the thing or talking about their kids, and they tell you something interesting that somehow is an in. And when I speak about an in to your story, it is the thing that I start with. It is the, oh, there's my clip off the top. Oh, this is how I'm going to get into either who this person is or the world around us, whether it's Joe was, shoveling, for his neighbor today, and this happened. And then you can it's a weird intro, but it's interesting. And it's not just the generic of this is happening in our world today. So sometimes if we have those opportunities to actually just talk one-on-one as a person, you get to get this interesting, oh, it was his birthday today. What? Okay. Something interesting that somehow changes your in. It doesn't even necessarily change the story, but it really changes the tone, or it humanizes the person, which is half of our job as well, is to humanize something to make it interesting so people will learn and listen.
What's your process in terms of figuring out who you do talk to in a daytime, whether it be someone who's particular to a story or an expert? What are, again, with communicators listening, how can they make their experts, if they have them, more obvious to you? This is assuming they want to talk to you, but basically trying to make, someone easily findable. What, when you have a story that comes across, for a day, what's the first thing you do, or what are the things you think about in terms of access to people?
A lot of the time we're looking for experts, whether it's political experts, whether it's right now, scientific experts, or, we've also had Black Lives Matter movement. So we're trying to find people to talk about race and trying to talk about interracial relations, things like that. I mean, social media has helped a lot because we have way more access now to people. The traditional concept of going through a gatekeeper sometimes doesn't happen anymore, because we can find people on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter that are, and I've done it at night where I'm like, hey, let me know if you ever want to talk about this, and sometimes it doesn't happen for that story, but it might happen later on. But it would be amazing if, PR people, whether you're at a university or whether you are fronting for an organization, if you could create a relationship with people, and really relationships do actually matter. If you create a relationship with somebody at whatever station, whatever paper, what have you, where you checked in and you said, what are you guys looking for? Because things change. I can say in the last year, our focus for what we want to cover has changed because we saw the reckoning of Black Lives Matter on our streets. We had a lot more people speaking out about racial injustice, and we looked at the people that we constantly go to. And we all have our people that we go to because, they've got the ring light, they're ready to go. They will be there, they'll talk to you, which is, key. But we have to remember that we need to have not just white men or white women. We need to get voices of, other people and people who look like our world and our community, speaking as experts and showing their side of the story and exploring those stories, because otherwise we're doing a serious injustice to our population and the stories that need to be told. And also in that concept of that we need to be challenging authority and challenging the voices of the status quo. So that's something I know that we've been looking for. And right now, if I was a PR person, whatever I'm working for, that would be in the back of my head. That would be like, who are people that are being overlooked? Because we just keep constantly going back to the fail safe of, oh, I know this person, they talk about politics all the time. And I've seen a shift in the last little while where it's trying to get female voices and people of color. And it's incredibly important to continue that, not just at a national level, but at a local level as well.
Yeah. Because you talk about trying to make it relatable for people, right? So when people see people who reflect their experience, then that makes your product more valuable to your audience too, right?
And those conversations, once again, it's a new person that I get to meet. And every single time that I have a Zoom interview with somebody, especially that is somebody new that I've never met, or somebody who is starting younger, starting up to put their brand as an expert or a commenter, or, and I say to them, I'm like, listen, you have my email now. And, anytime that you think that something needs to have a light shone on it, you have access to me. I know who you are. We can tell me about stories that are going about, tell me about things that are happening. And it creates that two-way street. So it's not just about one story, but you're trying to open up constantly to other story ideas that are out there.
Right. One of the areas that I talk to communicators about is when there's a brewing story that's come along quickly that's of high interest, but is difficult to kind of piece together, either because you're having a difficulty as a reporter trying to access experts or people particular to the story, but you don't want to let it go. And maybe it's a little bit less of an issue when you've got a set time for newscasts. But for example, in Ontario, where you've got a couple of all news network, or I guess nationally, when you've got all news networks, that you're up against it as someone who's going to be identified, or a responsible party, I guess, in a story, and you're not responding. What I say is that if you're not responding and they can't even get experts, don't think the story is not being covered. And in some cases, you will go to the non-experts. You will go to the person in the street to talk about something just to get reaction and try to get whether, the newsworthiness or trying to get the emotion out of it. Can you talk about or think about the times when you use people in the street to color or to complement a story? Is that one of the times, or is it something other than that?
Sometimes there is something happening in the world. Often enough, it's politics, or it can be the most boring story on the face of the earth, but it affects us all. It affects us all, and we call them streeters, and we go to the street and we see what people are thinking. And sometimes, and you're right, sometimes there's not an expert, or there's people who don't want to talk about it. They're taking their time in preparing whatever it is, whether it's a scandal, whether it's a whatever, and they don't want to. So we go to the people. But it's also a way to challenge people not talking about things. So if your organization is under the microscope, or your politicians are under the microscope for something, and they are not talking about it. In Alberta, we had Aloha Gate, where several of our ministers went to Hawaii for Christmas, and they weren't talking about it. And there was on Twitter was on fire, and there were people who were just like, I found this person, they're playing Sherlock Holmes, and they are, tracking down where people are, and Instagram and things like that. And that would be a time that you might go to the street and say, well, what do you think about people going to Hawaii when they're telling everybody to stay at home? Because it challenges the politicians. We're going to keep with this narrative. We're going to let people say what they want unless you have something to say. So often enough, that is, sometimes it's a temperature take. You're just trying to see how people feel, if people really care. And sometimes the things you get on streeters, you never know what you're going to get. But sometimes it can also be a way of filling the void until the person who's responsible, or the people in charge or under the microscope, finally come to an answer.
Right. What's your view on in those kinds of situations when a company or an organization would issue a statement? So basically they're meeting you halfway. They're not commenting, but they're also not responding to what you're really asking. Because I think in many people's minds that, okay, well, we've responded, we put a statement out there, especially in television. And again, maybe this is different from a year ago, but a company comes out, you're pressuring them or criticizing them. They come out with a statement rather than giving up someone that you can dialogue with. How do you treat that? Do you feel less inclined, the need to sort of balance that story, or how do you deal with that?
I hate statements. I will just say that working in television, statements, they let the air out of your story, and, we try so hard, and we're competing so hard with so many other things to try and create a story that has life to it. It's not just womp, womp, womp. But once you hit a statement from an organization, it lets the air out of the story. Like it really just, it's like, you've got all this sound and video and people and emotion. And in a statement, they say, and it's always this verbose academic, thing that is clunky. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm sure that your English degree has been put to great use here.
Mhm.
But, once again, I'm writing at a grade 8, grade 9 level with feeling and emotion and sound and video. And then we come up on a statement board and there is this, which is such a jerk to the ear because it's not written for the ear. It's written for the eye, perhaps.
Yeah.
I understand why they write it that way.
Yeah.
They're they don't want to sound that they don't know how to communicate anything beyond a grade 8 level, especially if you get something from a university. Often enough, it's very academic and flowery, and you're like, "Oh, that's a lot of sentences, and I'm not really sure what you said." So, and often enough, they're very vague. They're very this is basically an acknowledgement that you have spoken to us.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I understand. I have the two brains where I can sit there and I can understand why they put out statements. It's a very vague sounding. We are looking into this. We are doing our due diligence. Yes, we understand there is a problem. That's generally what most statements end up saying. Or, it would be great though, even if they just sent out something of a person, because I understand why they don't, because they don't have the information. They can't give you more than what you want. They're not ready for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand statements, but if you can not with a statement, if you have the opportunity to do a face-to-face instead, and because you're not worried about anything, then go for it. Because I think it really, it takes statement boards take away. They seem like a bit of a here's what they said.
Right. Well, I think the other part of it is also legalese, right? So sometimes the lawyers at companies or organizations would get involved as well, and trying to just kind of, like you say, sort of keep it vague so that they keep their options open in terms of talking about it and so on. So looking ahead, so if and when we ever get out of COVID, is it going to be difficult for you to get back into the swing of going out and trying to find people physically when you don't have the excuse of not to?
Oh, well, it's so funny because my schedule, I work at night, so I work the 3 to midnight shift, and it's so funny because my life is just COVID a lot of the time, because every day pretty much we have a press conference at 3:30, and it's our medical chief officer of health, and that's what I do, and that's my life. And I slowly work on things throughout the week to try and get a story that's a different take on something else. But so it'll be very interesting hanging out into the world again. And actually, I will say we still do some live interviews during 6 o'clock during the news and things like that, because with Zoom and Skype, people are used to it. They're not afraid to do it. We don't have to go and do the setup outside somebody's house or outside of a university or wherever to have you, or in the studio, because we're trying to keep fewer people coming into the building. But it will be weird. But I think we're going to go back to, I think it'll be a hybrid. I think there really will be, because now that people know how to do it, they're not afraid of it. And also, people are so used to now doing this Zoom interviews, but also, like, as much as we were talking about how people were kind of awkward years ago with the whole concept of B-roll of, okay, now I need to shoot, you know what I mean? Because so many people have a phone now and they're constantly talking to their phone and taking selfies. People are a lot more digitally aware and more comfortable in front of a camera than probably they've ever been before, because they have one and they watch and they digest, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or whatever, what have you. They're ingesting so much more media now. So everybody's a little bit more media savvy in some fashion.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And the themes that we talked about today, we've talked about with other people and we've referenced here on the podcast. So it's really amazing to kind of hear you sort of verbalize what's going on the other side of the microphone, and to know that, you know what, people are trying to get stuff done every day, and with regards to communicating, but there's objectives that have to get met. And when you're faced with deadlines and trying to connect with people, it's interesting to hear, what it actually comes down to in terms of brass tacks, in terms of putting a story together and so on. So Tara, I really want to thank you for taking the time to speak to me on the podcast here. Enjoyed and was great to engage with you in terms of the work you did when you were in London, and so happy that you're doing so well in Calgary and you're finding new life out there and good times. And I know that my audience really appreciates being able to kind of be taken into the reporter's corner and the journalism side of trying to communicate. And I think the insights that you gave today were really great, really relatable, and I'm sure that people will benefit from them. So thanks again for being on the podcast.
Oh, fantastic. It's been great to connect, Keith.
And so once again, the theme of relationships between communicators and the media has once again highlighted itself here in this episode. You really can't broadly communicate without engaging media. So you need to engage on a regular basis and not just get stuck on a story that may be in front of you on any given day. Over the long run, this will spawn the benefit of having people at the other end of the phone line, people who can actually help you achieve your communication goals, especially when you find yourself the focus of a negative or difficult story. Also in this episode, we discovered that general assignment reporters are not necessarily experts on every subject, perhaps not a shocking revelation. But do take time as a communicator to educate regular beat reporters about your business, just like the way you would reach out to people outside of your organization or routine stakeholder groups to tell them what you're up to. We hope to keep bringing you the best in the business from both sides of the media microphone, who will help you better understand and develop your messages and stories. For now, thanks for connecting. Speaking of Media is available on all podcast platforms. Plus, we've now added a feature on YouTube. Just search Speaking of Media. There, I hope you will listen, like, comment, and subscribe to the cast, as that will help us expand the show's reach and attract quality content. Please consider joining our Speaking of Media Communicators discussion group on Facebook. You'll also find us on Instagram, LinkedIn under my profile, and on Twitter @MediaSpeaking. I'm Keith Marnock, and through other episodes, I look forward to our next time together when we will be speaking of media.